Hi, this is Chris. And I wanted to talk on today's video podcast, the topic of researching the legislative history of an enacted California statute. Now, from time to time, we have to research the legislative history of a bill that was enacted into law in the state of California. And we have a couple of options to pursue in researching that legislative history. So let's go through some of those avenues for you to pursue. First, be sure that you're generally familiar with how bills are enacted in California. Do you understand the legislative process? Know the differences between the Assembly and Senate, the difference between policy and fiscal committees, the differences between bill analyses prepared for committees versus the floor, some of the different entities that create documents that are considered during the legislative process, such as the Department of Finance, state agencies, perhaps even the legislative analyst or other organizations. Because it's important when you research the legislative history of an enacted statute in the state of California to have a basic understanding of what the legislative history consists of and where to look for that legislative history. So if you go beyond just simply reading the statute, you can hopefully find some other valuable, what we call extrinsic information that was, or that will give you some insights on how the legislature intended a law to have an impact to address a particular area of concern or interest. Another issue you have to decide early on before you get into your potential deep dive into the legislative history of an enacted statute is to decide how much time you have to spend on this research project. How quickly do you need the materials? How much time can you conduct this research? Do you have a long period of time? Is it compressed? Do you have a few hours a day that you can spend for a couple of days? Sometimes state legislative history is a little elusive. And California, like so many other states, is not an exception to that rule. For example, as opposed to the congressional record with the US Congress, which has basically verbatim transcripts of federal legislative proceedings, in the California legislature and many other states, they don't publish transcripts of committee hearings or floor debates. Now you can watch or download from the Assembly and Senate websites all committee hearings in recent years as well as floor debates, but nonetheless, that's sometimes difficult to track down and to listen to all of that. So the ability to glean a lot of information quickly can actually be time consuming and sometimes is not overly productive. So you want to try and avoid any potential frustration and decide, again, before you embark on your legislative history research, how much time you can devote to this effort. So the first thing that you want to do to get started then is checking some of the legislative history resources. Generally, most material is found online since 1993. If you have to go prior to 1993, then you're likely to have to visit the state archives for some older legislative materials. What information is actually available for the particular statute or the bill that you're looking at. So for 1993 forward, if you go to www.leginfo.legislature.ca.gov, the Office of Legislative Counsel that oversees that website through its Legislative Data Center has placed a lot of relevant legislative materials online since 1993. And this includes all the different versions of a bill text, the committee and floor analyses, the floor votes, the committee votes, other historical information. Over at the state archives, you also have a vast collection of original legislative papers that can be readily accessed by source and by session year. For example, they have a number of author files, committee files, in some instances, the governor's chaptered bill files, some of the party caucus files, generally the Senate floor analyses files, and you might have some other documentation that you can track down. For example, if the California Law Revision Commission had a study file on the issue or the bill, any agencies that have donated materials on bill files to the California State Archives, you can get. You can reach out to state archives at 916-653-2246. To be fair, there is some backlog there. You can also have you can go by and do a walk-in, which generally have priority. And for any materials that get photocopied, they charge generally around 25 cents a page. The next thing that you want to turn to is consultation with the annotated codes. Now, perhaps you can do some of this if you have Westlaw access, but otherwise you will utilize West annotated codes, which are the hardback books of the Constitution and codes, which are in blue, or the burgundy Deering's annotated codes. And so some of the questions that you're going to try and address is what bill or bills affected the statute, the code section now that you're looking at. What was the law prior to the adoption of your statute or the changes to your statute? Did the bill that you're looking at add, amend, or repeal sections of law? And so you need to follow the text of the statute and find references to the laws adopted that particular session that affected the code section that you're looking at. So you'll need information like the bill number, the chapter number to help guide your legislative history research. Next up, you're going to want to review the text of the session laws. And obviously the session laws are based upon the 2-year legislative session. And these are the laws from each 2-year legislative session in California. And they have both codified and uncodified acts. The uncodified ones are ones that are not placed into one of the 29 California codes. Now, sometimes a bill will have basically a preamble, like legislative findings and declarations, or a statement of purpose of some sort. That might help you, in determining what the legislature's intent was. You can also, like courts, compare versions of a bill as it went through the legislative process and the different amendments that were made to the bill. So you definitely want to review different versions of a bill. What words or phrases or code sections were changed in the different versions of the bill. The courts have historically ruled that contemporaneous unpassed legislation might be a significant indicator of the intent underlying legislation that was considered during the same session. So for example, were there any similar bills that didn't pass, but again, on the same topic from that session? If you have the ability to check Lexis or Westlaw and their databases, obviously, the online research tools can be very helpful. There are also commercial providers, folks like Legislative Research and Intent. These folks provide legislative history research services. They supply research assistance and resources. They certify the documents that they find, and they can even provide expert testimony in court. Then you want to review the Assembly and Senate journals. Some questions that you might ask here include what happened in the legislature while this bill made its way through the process. So what specifically was its history? What committees considered the bill? things like that. The journals, to be fair, have limited information, but you also may run across reference to committee reports, maybe a letter of intent by the author of the bill. Those types of things can be found in the Assembly or Senate daily journals. As I mentioned before, compare the different versions of a bill, identify the text that's been added or repealed or changed. That can help clarify or shed light on the intent of the legislature. Be aware of these different versions as introduced, as amended, could be amended multiple times. The chaptered version of a bill. You also want to take a look at the Legislative Council's digest that's generally on the first page of a bill. Determine when maybe the language came into print, maybe in an amendment. Obviously, you want to check the analyses for those bills so that you can see a discussion of those changes. Again, as I mentioned, previous legislation on the topic that's related could also help shed light on the intent of the legislature. Next, you want to turn to the Assembly and Senate websites, at least for information from 1993 on. And since 2018, January of 2018, up to the present, the Senate and Assembly are required to make videos and audio tapes of all legislative committee hearings and floor sessions and post them on their respective websites. And so those video files and audio files are available for the last 4 or 5 years now. It's also helpful, I think, to look at some media coverage around the time that your bill was considered. And it might help you with finding out, like, why was this statute adopted? What need was prompted? Or did the media coverage give rise to why an author, a legislator, introduced the bill in the first place? Maybe media coverage could explain what the problem was that the legislature was trying to address. So sometimes news media coverage prior to or during or even after the enactment of a statute that you're looking at might provide some useful information and perhaps give some insights into the intent of the legislature. You obviously want to contact the Assembly or Senate committees and the author's office, particularly if they're still in office, and ask them to provide any information and give you any insights as to what prompted this to happen, the bill introduction, perhaps even what's happened since the statute was enacted. Has there been any responses from an agency, for example, that was charged with administering the statute, how they've interpreted or applied the statute? Did they adopt any regulation? Have the courts looked at it? Have there been any, scholarly information published, or again, media accounts? A lot of the legislative offices have potentially very useful information, including their analyses, correspondence with interested parties, etc. And the more recent the legislation, the more likely you'll find more detailed information. Gaining access to these records sort of varies, but there is the Legislative Open Records Act, LORA, L-O-R-A, in the Government Code, which assures public access as specified. There are some exemptions from that. You also want to take a look at some other documents to try and determine legislative history and intent. For example, the California courts have generally accepted the following items as evidence of legislative history and intent of enacted statutes, including things like any interim hearing studies, the testimony given at informational hearings that might have preceded the enactment of a statute, Other formal studies or recommendations, like from the Little Hoover Commission or the California Law Commission or a particular state agency. The bill background worksheets that you can get from the legislative committees that the author's office is required to fill out and complete before a bill is heard in that committee. Obviously, the policy and fiscal committee analyses, as well as the floor analyses. Perhaps a fiscal report from the Department of Finance, statements by the author, the legislative author's letter to the governor, for example, might be helpful. Statements like letters submitted by proponents and opponents, other position papers, the analyses prepared by state agencies or departments, maybe an official opinion's been requested by the Office of Legislative Counsel or the Attorney General of the state. Even enrolled bill reports from the governor's office that's been submitted to the governor by state agencies, the Department of Finance, Legislative Council. Those are all valuable things as well. So the list isn't exhaustive, of course, but there are quite a number of avenues that you can utilize when you're researching enacted statutes here in the state of California.